G'day! Welcome to True Blue History. I'm Adam Blum. Today's special guest is Mat McLachlan, owner of Mat McLachlan Battlefield Tours. And he's joined us today to talk about the Battle of Mont and Quentin in late 1918. Hi Matt, thanks for joining us on the show.
My pleasure, Adam. Good to be here, mate.
I do appreciate it, Matt. Thank you very much. So, basically, I wanted to get you on, Matt, to tell us a little bit about Mont and Quentin and why it is so important and one of our greatest achievements for the AIF in 1918. So, can you just give us a little background of the lead up to Mont and Quentin?
Yeah, absolutely. So Mont and Quentin is an important battle for me personally, and I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit later on about my sort of family connections to Mont and Quentin. But as an action that the AIF took, it's a fantastic example of just how far the Australians had come by late 1918. So the story of Mont and Quentin really begins in August, at the start of August, the 8th of August, when the Australians and the Canadians spearheaded the big attack, which was started what is known as the 100 Days, or the advance to victory, basically the big British and French and American allied effort to push the Germans back and to win the war. So that really started on the 8th of August and was spearheaded by the Australians and the Canadians. And then throughout August, the British, if we look at the British sector of the line, the Australians, the Canadians, British forces, New Zealanders, this real combined effort to keep pushing the Germans back and attack pretty much every day. And just keep driving the Germans back and never let them rest, never let them get a break, push them out of one position before they've got a chance to catch their breath, push them out of the next one. And so this is what happened throughout August. So the Australians were fighting very, very heavily. Some of the most intense fighting the Australians participated in during the entire war. And then by the end of August 1918, they were facing this formidable position known as Mont and Quentin. Now, Mont means mountain in French, but it's not much of a mountain. It's only about 100 metres high. But in the flat, sort of rolling Somme countryside, this hill gave really good observation over the Somme River. It was located right on a bend in the Somme River, which gave it very good defensive, a very good defensive position. And next to it was the town of Peronne, which was a town with a wall running around it, which again was very, very good to defend for the Germans. So the combined positions of Mont and Quentin and Peronne was a pretty formidable position on the Somme River at this stage of the war.
So how prepared were the Germans, and did they know that the Australians were going to attack Mont and Quentin?
Well, they knew an attack was coming by the Allies because it was the obvious position for defence and therefore the obvious position that needed to be taken in the attack. So if you imagine, and I'd encourage everyone listening to look on a map, but there's a big bend in the Somme River, and Peronne and Mont and Quentin sit right in that bend. So rivers are natural defensive positions. It's very difficult for armies to cross rivers. It has been since the origins of warfare. Rivers are always incredibly difficult for armies to cross. And the Germans knew it, and then having these big defensive positions right in the bend in a river meant it was a fairly impregnable sort of spot. And so the Germans knew that it would be attacked, not specifically by Australian troops, but they knew that the Allies were going to launch an attack there. And so they reinforced the Mont. They called for volunteers to come in and hold the position, and they had very specific instructions that they had to hang on to this position and not fall back if they came under attack.
So who took part in the attack, Matt? What divisions from the AIF were involved in the battle?
Well, the interesting thing about this battle is it's really a good example of John Monash, the commander of the Australians, really pushing his men. And you know, this is a bit of speculation on my part, but it's been discussed a lot that the reason the attack came about, the reason the Australians were chosen to attack there was because Monash put them forward. Monash said, "My men can take this position," and it was something that his British commanders were quite sceptical about. And the reason for that is the Australians, as good as they were very understrength by this stage. They'd simply, they'd lost so many men that they simply didn't have enough left to carry out these big attacks. But Monash was quite determined to push the Australians forward, and I think part of the story of that is that Monash had done very, very well from the time since he'd taken over the Australian Corps. He'd had the very famous Battle of Hamel in July 1918, which, even though only small, had demonstrated this new sort of all-arms tactics. He then applied that in a very effective way on the 8th of August. And the 8th of August is really Monash's greatest achievement as the commander of the Australians. And we talk about the Battle of Hamel as being his greatest achievement, but really it was the 8th of August that should be remembered as the Monash's crowning glory on the battlefield. But I think what was happening by the end of August is Monash was feeling the one thing he didn't have, in spite of all these victories, the one thing he didn't have was a purely Australian victory. Because at every one of these victories, including Hamel, which was mostly Australian, there were American troops involved at Hamel, there were Canadians and British and everyone else involved on the 8th of August. I think he felt that these attacks the Australians had participated in had always been part of an Allied effort, and he really wanted to demonstrate what the Australians could do. And it was a pretty audacious idea for Monash to attack Mont and Quentin. And as I said, his British commanders were quite sceptical. But in the end, it sort of came down to, well, have a go if you think you can do it. And so Monash had the opportunity to launch this attack on Mont and Quentin and the town of Peronne at the same time.
What were the tactics and strategies being used in the attack?
Well, it's really interesting. I also just remembered that I didn't answer your question specifically about who took part in the attack. It was the 2nd Division took part in the attack on the Mont, and then the 5th Division took part in the attack on the town of Peronne, and they were supported by other units in the RAF, but predominantly the 2nd Division on Mont and Quentin and the 5th Division on the town of Peronne, so they would attack together. So the thing that I always think is very funny about this one is it was a very big gamble that Monash was taking, because Monash was the key proponent of this philosophy of, his famous quote was, it's not the job of the men to wither away under machine gun fire or on the point of enemy bayonets. They should be supported by the maximum number of mechanical resources to help them win objectives. And it seems to me that he completely abandoned that philosophy at Mont and Quentin. There was some artillery supporting them, but not anything like the scale that we'd seen on these previous battles. There were no tanks that he'd used to such good effect on these previous battles. This was a good old infantry attack. Basically, he was just going to put the blokes in and get them to charge straight at the Mont. That was the plan. So it was a big gamble. In my estimation, Monash was actually abandoning a lot of the techniques that he'd used so effectively up to this point. So it was a very, very big gamble. And the other thing that's vitally important to note is how under strength the Australians were. So to give you an indication, a battalion is supposed to be about 1,000 men. That's a battalion at full strength is about 1,000 men. But of course, we hadn't seen that since the very opening days of the war, because losses and men were killed and wounded and couldn't be replaced. And so as the war went on and as the battalions suffered losses that couldn't be replaced, the conscription referendums had been defeated back in Australia, so there would be no conscription to bring up the strength of the battalions. So that 1,000 figure of a full-strength battalion, basically the idea became that if you've got a battalion with 800 men, that's a sort of an ideal number. If you can muster up 800 blokes out of your 1,000 to participate in an attack, you're doing pretty well. But as the losses grew, they revised that down and they said, okay, about 600 is probably the bare minimum that we would want for any sort of attack. And when you think about that, that's 60% of the battalion's strength. That's significant losses. So by this stage of the war, 1,000 was full strength, 800 was considered good, 600 was probably the bare minimum to put a battalion in. Well, at Mont and Quentin, if you look at the 20th Battalion, for example, they had 320 men who went into this attack. And the 17th Battalion had, I think, about 340. So we're talking here, that's about 1/3 of their strength. And so it just emphasises, again, the huge gamble that was being taken. These battalions were ridiculously under strength. I was reading some figures about this, doing research for this, that an average company by this stage, so a company could have been up to 250 men at full strength. Some of the companies here, when they looked, by the time they had to pull out reserves and backup troops, they had 80 men in the entire company. Now, it's just crazy how just the tiny numbers. And in the official history, Charles Bean even refers to it as the tiny columns of men marching towards the position. So I can't emphasise that enough, how under strength these battalions were. But I should also mention that they were absolutely outstanding fighters by this stage. So even though the numbers of men had been reduced in a platoon, so a platoon, instead of having about 30 men in the platoon, probably now had between 10 and 15 men in the platoon. But they still had the same armament that they would have had as a unit of 30 men. So they would still have, importantly, things like rifle grenadiers, who are men who could fire grenades from a rifle, so it can go a lot further than you can throw a grenade. Most importantly, each platoon had 2 Lewis guns, and a Lewis gun was a light, very portable machine gun that was a hugely valuable weapon on the Western Front. So each platoon, even though it might only have 10 or 15 men in it, still had 2 Lewis guns. So it still had a lot of firepower. What it didn't have was a lot of backup for that weapon. So they couldn't carry as much ammunition. It didn't have as many infantrymen to rush forward. but it still had a decent amount of firepower. And I think Mont and Quentin, for me, that's the thing it demonstrates more than anything else. It's just this, the key attributes that the AIF possessed by this stage of the war, and indeed all the British units that were fighting, they possessed some really key attributes. And that was that they were very, very mobile, they had lots of firepower, and they could operate pretty much independently of everything that was going on around them. So whereas in 1916, if a unit had attacked at a battlefield like Pozières or Fromelles, and even into 1917, if they had come across a German strong point that they didn't know was there or that hadn't been taken out by the artillery barrage, the only way to deal with that was either to just rush forward and suffer lots of casualties trying to take it, or to try and get word back to your artillery or your trench mortars, so can you put some fire on this position for us so that we can attack it? That was obviously a very slow, very cumbersome process, particularly with terrible communications during the First World War. By this stage of 1918, what it meant was that the individual platoons and companies had their own firepower with them. They had a large number of Lewis guns, they had rifle grenades, they had heavily armed infantrymen. So if they came across a German strongpoint, they could act decisively. They could simply say, at company level, the company commander could say, okay, this platoon will go left, this platoon will go right, this one will go straight up the middle, and we're going to deal with that machine gun position. So they were a very efficient mobile force, and that's really, I think, the tactic that Mont and Quentin demonstrates most clearly. That combination of mobility, independence, firepower, and adaptability, that was a hallmark of the Australians by this stage of the war.
So, in your opinion, Matt, of Monash launching this attack, would you say it was reckless on his part to choose understrength divisions to take part in the attack, or do you disagree with that?
I don't think it was reckless. He backed his Australians. He knew they were a great fighting force, and he felt they could do it. And he was right. They did do it incredibly successfully. And when it comes to using understrength divisions, he had no other choice. If the Australians were going to keep participating, they were going to fight as understrength units. They'd started doing things to try and compensate for the lack of men. So, for example, the companies in each battalion, they dropped from four companies to 3 companies, and then they sort of started grouping men together in only 3 companies instead of 4. The same thing with the battalions. Brigades dropped down to only to 3 battalions instead of 4. So that this carried on. They were trying to consolidate the men as best they could, but he really had no choice. He would have loved to have had more men, particularly considering how good the Australians were at fighting by this stage of the war, but they simply didn't have the numbers. So I would say it's a gamble. It was a risky move. It could have been a disaster, and I think his British commanding officers thought it was going to be a disaster. I don't think the Australians were at risk of getting wiped out, but they could have easily advanced and been stopped by heavy fire and not gotten any further. So I think the fact that the Australians managed to take all these positions and to capture Mont and Quentin and Peronne within the space of 3 or 4 days that's the reason we remember this as one of the most remarkable achievements of the war.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We should talk about the other side, the Germans. What was their strengths at this late stage of 1918? What was their fighting strength like?
Well, it's a really good question, Adam, and it's something we often overlook. We seem to think of when we assess really any war that we participated in, we really only assess it from our own point of view. And we overlook the fact that there was an enemy on the battlefield and that what we had to do was respond to activities that the enemy was taking. And with that in mind, we should remember the Germans had fought a very long, painful war, and also they'd fought it with huge restrictions, both economically and militarily, because of blockades and the efforts the Allies were taking to really isolate Germany within Europe. So the Germans, by this stage of the war, if we thought we had manpower problems, the Germans really had manpower problems. So we shouldn't forget that as brilliant as the Australians and the British and the Canadians and the New Zealanders and even the Americans to some extent were, and the French, of course, by this stage of the war, we must remember that the Germans were a rapidly depleting force, that they could not keep the numbers in the line that they had before. The men that they had in the line were made up of a lot of new recruits. There's photos of captured Germans, and a lot of them are teenage boys. Like we saw in the Second World War, they pretty much press ganged anyone who could hold a rifle into the line. That's not to say they weren't still a formidable enemy, and Mont and Quentin demonstrated they were pretty tough defenders. But they were suffering from the same things we were, which was a loss of manpower and a big rise in the number of new recruits. In a lot of ways, the Australians, I think unit for unit, the Australians and other British units were far superior to the Germans in many cases by this stage, simply because the Australians could not replenish their battalions with new recruits because there were no new recruits to replenish them with. So therefore, even though their numbers were very, very small, all of the men in a battalion were very experienced at fighting on the battlefield, whereas the Germans may have had superior numbers, but a lot of those men were new recruits.
So, as you previously stated, that the battalions were going into this attack quarter strength, and there's a famous quote that Monash, he knew that the battalions were low. The men obviously fighting was at a low number, and there's a famous quote that he ordered the Australians to scream like bushrangers. So, for that, was there a bit of confusion with the Germans facing? Did they feel that there was more men attacking than there actually was?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, that one. And a couple of things we should say about that is Monash did a very good job planning this battle. It was very well planned, and it went pretty much to plan during the course of the battle. But what we should remember about this was not Monash's battle, really. Once he planned it, and this was the case always in the First World War, a general could plan a battle in as much detail as he wanted to, but once that battle began, he virtually had no control over what was going on the battlefield because there was poor communication. He didn't know what was going on because there was no way of getting messages back to him. So in many cases, the general who had planned a battle became a bit of an observer by the time the battle took off. And this is a perfect example. Monash did have input into the battle as things changed, and he gave his opinion. But it mostly came down to his divisional and brigade and battalion commanders and even company commanders. And the victory really belongs to them, particularly his divisional commanders. They were the ones who made decisions on the spot about where they should allocate their men. And the battalion commanders did a wonderful job. The brigade commanders did a very good job as well. So even though Monash gets the glory for planning the battle, what we should say is that it was the men below him who really carried it out and adapted to changes on the battlefield. So the victory really belongs to them. In terms of the yelling like bushrangers, that's a very famous aspect of the battle, which I have no doubt occurred. But in my opinion, it probably was more for the men than it was for the Germans. I don't think the Germans were going to be too put off by a bunch of yelling Australians. I think it was more to raise the energy of the Aussies as they attacked, in the way that we saw the Confederates during the American Civil War doing the rebel yell, to really raise their spirits as they went in. So I don't think the Germans were going to be fooled by. They weren't going to be fooled into thinking there were more troops attacking them than they realised. But I think that the yelling did more to sort of raise the spirits and get the blood up of the Aussies as they charged in. And I think it was pretty effective because they did. They went at them on pretty hard.
They certainly did. Exactly right. And Matt, you've walked that ground many, many times. And just to give the listeners a perspective, it's not a very big hill, is it? Like really, it's when you stand at the bottom of it, when you get to the top, it's not very big at all, is it?
No, not at all. It's really only a hill. And if you approach it from the Perron side, so you can come sort of from the south, which was the way the Australians came, and go to the village of Clary, and then cross the river there, and then you can look straight up the way the Australians advanced. Yes, it does look like a slope heading up to a hill that you can see. But if you come from the opposite way, from the Perron direction, and you head towards it, you don't even realise you're on top of a hill. And it's actually now, these days, it's connected to the town of Perron. And so when you drive through Perron to visit the top of the Mont, you actually drive through Perron, and then you drive out through suburbs. It's just little houses and all the way out. And then you come to this little village, and then you realise you're on top of Mont Quentin. It's not till you get past it that you actually look out over the view. So yeah, it's deceptive. It's pretty flat country in the Somme, sort of rolling riverland of the Somme, and so any sort of height gives you a big advantage. And the First World War was all about high ground, because high ground gave you observation. If you had the high ground, not only did it give you the advantage that your enemy would have to attack uphill towards you, which is always a challenge, but it also gave you observation. You could fire your guns from behind a hill where they were protected. You could fire your artillery and watch where the shells landed, and so correct your artillery without having to expose the guns to enemy fire. You could see when troops were assembling, and that's part of the reason I said I don't think the Germans were fooled about the number of troops that were in front of them, because they were watching the troops cross the river and assemble in front of them. They could count them individually, so they knew how many men were facing them. And the answer to that question of how many men is facing us is not many at all. They could see that the numbers were tiny. And so high ground is vitally important. And so, yeah, it's a little bit deceptive, but if you cross the river at Clary and walk in the footsteps of the Anzacs, it's pretty much unchanged since 1918, and you do get a very good perspective. And if you walk up it from the river in that direction, your heart rate will get up. You'll still be puffing by the time you get to the top. It's not like Kokoda Track or it's not like Gallipoli, but it's a decent slope if you have to charge up it, especially if there's machine guns and artillery firing at you while you're doing it.
Absolutely. So, what was the Germans' response once the AOF had taken Mont and Quentin? Did they counterattack, or what was their response?
Yeah, this is a really important thing that we should remember about Mont and Quentin is it was fought in two parts. And usually what happens is people really only talk about the first part of the battle. And so the first part of the battle took place in the early hours of the 31st of August, 1918. And this is when the Australians just did brilliantly. They charged up the slope. This is when they were yelling like Bushrangers. They were unstoppable. They overcame the machine gun posts. They just basically captured trenches. They ran riot. And in a ridiculously short amount of time, they were on the summit of the Mont, which was an absolutely extraordinary achievement. And that's when we hear the famous quote that General Rawlinson, who was Monash's commanding officer, we hear variations of it that he was shaving or he was just sitting down to breakfast when he heard a report that the Australians had captured Mont and Quentin, and he was amazed by this fact. And that's even what Monash put in his memoirs about the battle. That's what he put in there, that's why this was such a great feat of arms, that Rawlinson hadn't even finished breakfast when he heard that the Australians were on the summit of the Mont. And all of that is true, but what we should also remember is that is only half of the story. What then happened is the Germans counterattacked very, very strongly, and they pushed the Australians back off the summit, probably about halfway down the slope. And so the Germans almost immediately retook Mont and Quentin. The Australians captured it. The Germans came right back, counterattacked, and took it back. And so the Australians were pushed off the summit of the Mont. And then they had a decision to make. And this is where I said the divisional commanders came into their own. They said, what are we now going to do? So that by this stage, it's now the 1st of September. What are we going to do? And what they planned is, well, we're going to take it back. So we're now going to counterattack as well. So they fired an artillery barrage to really smash up the Germans on the Mont. The other thing we should point out here as well is during that morning of the 1st of September, there was a change in the garrison on the Mont. So the Germans that attacked were a very strong unit that attacked and took back the Mont. And then they were relieved by much weaker units in the afternoon. So we should bear that in mind as well, that the opposition faced in the afternoon wasn't quite as strong as it had been in the morning. But nevertheless, they still were very heavily armed and going to defend the Mont. And basically, so in the afternoon, at about 1:30 on the afternoon of the 1st of September, the Australians launched a counterattack of their own, swept back up the slope again, cleared the Germans from the summit, pushed on to some fortified positions behind the summit of the Mont, dug in there, and then the Australians then fought off several German counterattacks from that position. And so by the sort of the 2nd of September, they had secured the whole of Mont and Quentin. So we should remember that second phase of the battle as well. The one that gets all the credit and all the glory is, and quite rightly, is the 2nd Division sweeping up and the 20th Battalion, the 17th Battalion, the 19th Battalion pushing the Germans off on the morning of the 31st of August. But they did lose the summit later in the day, and it wasn't until the next day that it was finally secured.
So do we know if there was any POWs taken in this battle?
You mean from the German POWs?
From the German side.
Yeah, there were. I'm not sure the exact number, but many hundreds of Germans were taken prisoner. And the interesting thing about prisoners by this stage is since the 8th of August, well, for the month of August, from the 8th until the 31st, and if we include the 1st of September, the Battle of Mont and Quentin, the Australians took 14,000 German prisoners in the month of August. So that's an absolutely extraordinary number. So it just shows. It shows a couple of things. It shows how good the Australians were. It shows how much the Germans were keen to give up the fight, because most, by this stage of the war, Germans were pretty happy to surrender rather than fight to the death. But it just goes to show just what it mostly demonstrates is just this incessant, rolling, constant attack going on. They're just attacking every day, every day, every day. So for the Australians to take 14,000 prisoners effectively in August, really in the last 3 weeks of August, is just an extraordinary number, considering the tiny numbers of Australians that were participating in the war by this stage. Just really extraordinary figures.
Amazing figures. Like, just hearing that is just amazing. But for the Germans, obviously the loss of Mont and Quentin, did they know that the end of the war was coming quicker than they thought?
Yeah, it's a really good question, mate. I think the German plan at this stage was just to hold in any strong points that they could. So they knew they couldn't stop the Allies now. And it was by this stage as well that they were starting to think about discussing peace treaties and how the war was going to come to an end. but they wanted to hold as much as they possibly could. They needed to hold as much ground as they possibly could. So even if they had to come to the negotiating table to talk about a surrender, they would have a stronger hand if they held more ground. And so the German strategy at this stage was just hold on whatever strong points you can and inflict as many losses on the Allies as you possibly can. And that sums up Mons and Quentin and Peronne pretty neatly. It was just such a strong position. It was, as I said, there was a river in front of it. It was located in a bend in the river, which made it even stronger. They just said, just make a stand here. Just hold them up for as long as you possibly can. We can get more reinforcements to come in. And so that was the strategy all along the German line. Just find strong points and defend them as strongly as you can. And that's what they expected to do. They expected that they would be able to hold out at Mons and Quentin and Peronne for quite a while, and that it would become a real thorn in the side of the Allies. And this is what surprised and upset them so much, is that within the space of a few days, they'd lost not only Mons and Quentin, but then by 3rd or 4th of September, they'd also lost the entire town of Peronne, which they thought was impregnable. So it did absolutely upset German plans to hold the Somme River and to hold that line on the Somme River, because the only thing they had behind them now was the Hindenburg Line, which was the famous position that they had retreated to in 1917 and that had been fought so hard over. We saw it in the movie 1917, the retreat to the Hindenburg Line. The famous battles of Bullecourt were fought in the Hindenburg Line. The Battle of Arras was all fought around the Hindenburg Line. So huge fighting in 1917 to capture this position. And it was from that position the Germans then launched their spring offensive at the start of 1918. So in March and April 1918, when they'd launched their big counterattack that came close to winning the war, that had been launched from the Hindenburg Line. So all the ground that they'd now captured in that whole time, they were now losing very rapidly as the Allies pushed forward. And in this part of the line, the loss of Mons and Quentin and Peronne meant that the only thing the Germans had behind them was the Hindenburg Line. So this hastened their retreat to the Hindenburg Line. So they were back there much quicker than they expected, and it really enabled the Australians, the British, and the rest of the Allies to maintain this momentum to just keep pushing the Germans back. So by the time the Germans were rushed back to the Hindenburg Line, they didn't have time to prepare their defences. So then when only a week later the attacks on the Hindenburg Line began, the Germans were pushed out of there pretty quickly as well.
We should speak about, was there any Victoria Crosses won at Mons and Quentin?
Yeah, there was a couple. I think it was either 5 or 6 that were won between. Actually, I think it's even more than that. I think it's up to maybe 8 VCs were won between Mons and Quentin and Peronne. So a couple of notable VCs at Mons and Quentin. Edgar Towner was in the machine gun company, and he moved his machine guns around very effectively, and even used some captured German machine guns. He turned on the Germans, and he was responsible for, in a large part, of leading the defence that broke up German counterattacks on the 1st of September that stopped the Germans from taking back the Mont after it had been secured for the second time. And he was actually wounded in the head. He had a bullet that passed under his helmet and actually gave him quite a nasty wound across the top of his head. But he fought on. And there's actually a sunken lane near the cemetery on Mons and Quentin that you can go to today, which is always a really great spot to go, because that's where he set up his machine guns, in that sunken lane to fight off the German counterattack. And last time I was there, I found a whole heap of 303 bullets still lying there in the lane. So I wonder if they'd come out of one of the belts of one of his machine guns during that. So there was also a really famous... so he was an officer. There was another officer called Albie Lowerson who led an attack on a quarry at the back of Mons and Quentin. And the quarry is quite a famous part of the action. That was really that was the pivotal moment of the battle, the great climax of the battle. It was the 21st Battalion, I think, from memory, that captured the quarry at the back of Mons and Quentin. And then after that, the men that had been killed were buried in the quarry. The Australians were buried in that quarry. And you can still, if you go up there and if there's no crops in the field, you can still just see a subtle depression, which is the quarry there. So Albie Lowerson was another officer, and he won a Victoria Cross for leading his men in the attack on the quarry. So they were both officers. Towner and Lowerson were both officers. But there's one story that I think is particularly great, which is Bob McTeer. Bob McTeer was a private, a nuggety little bloke. And during the early stages, on the 31st of August, during the early stages of the advance, as they came up, they were actually advancing up a German trench that had been captured. Parts of the trench had been captured. The Australians were actually advancing up through the German trench, and they kept coming to blocks the Germans had put in place. So the Germans would pull earth and sandbags and barbed wire into the trench and then set up a machine gun behind it, and that was what was blocking the Australians. And each time they came to one of these blocks, McTeer, who was a runner, he was just supposed to go forward and report on what he could see and then come back to his officer to get instructions. Every time he came to one of these blocks, he'd jump out of the trench and run at it and throw grenades at it, and he cleared several of these blocks himself. and he was attacking another one that he saw up ahead. And as he ran towards it, they swung the machine gun around on him, and he was killed by that machine gun. So he died in his officer's arms, but he was awarded a posthumous Victoria Cross, and he's buried in Hem Farm Cemetery near the base of the Mont. So I always like visiting his grave. It's just such a great story. You know, a private just taking on the Germans on his own. It's a great Aussie story. So those were the 3 Victoria Crosses that were awarded for the attack on the Mont itself. And then I think it was 5 other Victoria Crosses were won by the 5th Division for attacks on Peron and also the other towns in the area as well. We shouldn't forget that there's a number of villages in the area that were also taken by the Australians at the same time. So there was a number of Victoria Crosses. Pretty much at every little village, someone did something fairly amazing and won a Victoria Cross. So I think from memory, the total number was 8 that were awarded for the actions between about 31st of August and the 4th of September. So pretty tough fighting, pretty impressive acts of individual bravery there.
Just amazing stories, and just the hairs stand up on the back of your neck. It's just, you hear some of those stories, and just such brave men, and just an amazing job that they did. So General Rawlinson described the advances made by the Australians as the greatest military achievement of the war. Would you agree with that observation?
It's a tough one for me. I'm a massive fan of what the Australians did at Mont St. Quentin. I think it was certainly a fantastic achievement, particularly given, I just love the elements. The understrength Australians, they were outnumbered. It's just a really great example of what the Aussies could achieve and what they basically did every day. Every day they just go in and attack these strong positions and just every day achieve this great success. So it's a fantastic example of that. So yeah, I do tend to think, given their tiny numbers, how outnumbered they were by the Germans, I do tend to think it's one of the most impressive Australian achievements. It's also a completely Australian achievement. There were no, except for some artillery, there were no British troops involved. There were no Canadians, New Zealanders. It was just the Aussies doing their thing. So yeah, I think as an example of what the Australians could achieve, it does stand out as a brilliant example. But at the same time, I know that Peter Stanley, the great Australian historian, has done some work on this as well, and he's determined that because of that change in the German defenders that I mentioned earlier, that the German defenders who came in after the Germans had recaptured the Mont and the ones that were defending it in the final counterattack by the Aussies, that they just weren't very good troops, and so that it was a little bit of a walkover that second phase of the battle. So he's argued that maybe we overplay Mont St. Quentin a little bit because the opposition wasn't as strong as we give it credit for. So I'm kind of in two minds. I think as an example of the Australians and the brilliant fighting force they'd become by 1918, it's hard to find a better example. Probably Villers-Bretonneux is the other one that stands out. The Aussies just going in and just getting the job done in spite of all opposition. So yeah, I know I'm flip-flopping between both positions here, but I do tend to think that Mont St. Quentin is a very good example of just Australian courage and ingenuity at this stage of the war.
No, I think that's an accurate assessment, Matt. I think you answered that very well. You did very well to answer that one. So why...
I'm always I'm always in two minds that Australians are very guilty of claiming that we won the war. We're very big on this, of saying that, the POWs didn't know what they were doing and we showed them how to win the war and you'd all be speaking German if it wasn't for us and all that stuff. That's massively overblown. We shouldn't do that. The one thing the First World War teaches us is it was a collegiate effort. Everyone helped everyone else. No one acted in isolation, and it was a combined effort to win the war. At the same token, though, because a lot of good historians have started stating that case, that, Australians, we shouldn't overplay our hand and what we achieved on the Western Front, there's also a danger that we go too far the other way, that we start to say, oh, well, the Australians were just part of the British Army and just any other British unit could have done as good a job. I don't think that's true at all. The Australians were an elite fighting force, along with the Canadians, along with the New Zealanders, along with the South Africans, and along with the best British units as well. There was a group of divisions that were absolutely elite by this stage of the war, and the Australians definitely should be included in that group. And there's not many of them. We're talking probably a dozen divisions that were the key divisions in the British Army. And so Australia definitely should be included in that group. So we shouldn't claim that we won the war, because that's unfair to all our allies. But at the same time, we shouldn't go the other way and downplay what a great fighting force the Australians were.
No, I'd agree with that, and I think most modern day historians would agree with that statement that you just stated. So for you, Matt, what's special when you walk this ground? at Mont and Quentin?
Well, there's a pretty strong personal connection for me, more so than any other First World War battlefield, pretty much. And the story is, if you'll indulge me a little bit, I'll tell the story of of my connection with Mont and Quentin. So my family comes from, I'll say that we come from West Wyalong, a little town in New South Wales, but we actually come from a little farming community outside West Wyalong, which was called Mallee Plains. And when the First World War started, we've all heard about the POWs battalions in the UK, where in 1914, throughout Britain, they wanted to raise, in each township, in each locality, they raised troops to all fight together, and they called them the POWs battalions. And it was pretty much the same in Australia. Men from similar areas were grouped together in battalions, although over much larger geographic areas than we saw in the UK. And that was the case of the little town that my family's from, of Mallee Plains in New South Wales. And the men that enlisted from that area, and several hundred of them enlisted from that area, and were all put in the 20th Battalion. And so the 20th Battalion fought quite spectacularly at Mont and Quentin in that first attack on the 31st of August, 1918. So that was sort of the backstory. And fast forward to the Second World War, my grandfather served in the Second World War, and he became president of the sub-branch of the RSL at Mallee Plains. And Mallee Plains doesn't even exist anymore. It's disappeared off the map. But at the time, after the Second World War, it not only did it exist, it had its own RSL sub-branch and its own RSL hall. There was a memorial hall. And so my grandfather, when my dad was a little boy, was the president of the Mallee Plains RSL. And in this shed, basically the hall at Mallee Plains, the memorial hall, was just a bit of an old rickety shed that had been there since the First World War. And it had three things in it. It had the Roll of Honour, listing all the men from the district who'd been killed, including my great-uncle, my grandfather's brother, who'd been killed in the Second World War. It had an old piano, and on the wall, it had an old German machine gun, which had been brought back as a war trophy after the First World War. And one day when my dad was a kid, he and his father went down to the hall just to check it out, and someone had prized the door open and stolen the piano. And so my grandfather determined that if the hall wasn't secure enough to keep a piano safe, then having a machine gun on the wall wasn't appropriate. So he took the machine gun home for safekeeping. So my dad grew up with this German First World War machine gun on his farm. And on the jacket of that machine gun was a hand-tapped-out brass plaque which said German light machine gun captured and claimed by the 20th Battalion at Mont and Quentin on the Somme, 31st of August 1918. So my dad grew up playing Cowboys and Indians with this German machine gun that had been captured at Mont and Quentin. And it had a bullet dint in the water jacket, and quite a remarkable thing. It was a Spandau 0815. When his father died and they sold the farm, this was lost. And then in 1994, when I really was starting to get very, very interested in the Western Front in particular, my dad had told me the story. I said, we've got to find this machine gun. And so we basically went on a bit of a mission to speak to all the farmers in the district and to see if we could find out what had happened. And about the third phone call we made, we rang one of the neighbouring farms near where my dad used to live, and the farmer said, a funny thing happened. The old wheat shed fell down last week. I went out to clear it out, and there was that machine gun propped up in the corner. And so we got the machine gun back, and now it's in storage now, and we're actually negotiating with the Anzac Memorial in Hyde Park to donate that to the memorial there so that it can be displayed, because it's such an important part of New South Wales history.
Oh, wow.
So I always had a soft spot for Mont and Quentin because of that rather long-winded story I just told you. And so one of the highlights of the first time I visited the battlefield was going to Mont and Quentin to walk that ground, and I walked as well as I could in the footsteps of the 20th Battalion up those slopes and to where I estimated that machine gun had been captured. So it was really just a remarkable connection for me with my grandfather, who died when I was young, and with those men from the 20th Battalion that I sadly never knew because they all died before I came along. But I just feel I have that link with them and with this history. So Mont and Quentin has always had a real soft spot for me. Such a fascinating battle, a great Australian achievement, and then of course I've got this tangible connection with it because of this machine gun that was captured there. So it's always been a pretty special place for me to go and visit.
Oh, that's. I'm glad you told that story, and for the listeners, it's a great personal connection for you. So, for the listeners, Matt, what if they do plan a trip to Mont and Quentin and obviously the neighbouring town of Peron? What can they see left over from the war today?
There's not a huge amount of that sort of great tangible stuff that we love to see. You know, when you go to the Somme battlefields for the 1916 battlefields, you're going to see trenches and the Windmill Memorial at Pozières, and there's so much stuff to see. When you go up to to Ypres and the Ypres salient, you're going to see German pillboxes, and there's just so much from that fighting in 1916 and 1917. There was just so much fighting that took place over such a long time in such a small area that there's lots of things left over from the war. It's not quite the same on these 1918 battlefields, particularly the late 1918 battlefields, because the fighting just swept through there so quickly. This was a battle that took place over a couple of days, whereas if we look back to 1916 in Pozieres, for example, that took 6 weeks. So that was very much the nature of the fighting in late 1918. So there's not as much tangible stuff to see from this fighting. So when you go to the 1918 battlefields, and I'd really encourage people to do it if they're over in that area, but it's more using your imagination. It's more going to a village that the Australians captured and walking through it and just getting a feel for the atmosphere and visiting a local cemetery where you'll see those Australians buried. And Mont St. Quentin's a little bit like that. A couple of key features. Firstly, you can walk up the slope in the footsteps of the Australians. So the hill itself is a tangible connection with the battlefield. At the top is the magnificent 2nd Division Memorial. So each of the 5 Australian divisions put a memorial on a key battlefield where they felt they made a great achievement during the First World War. And the 2nd Division chose Mont St. Quentin, which says a lot about the importance of the battle. And famously, it's different to the other divisional memorials. It shows an Aussie standing, just a sort of sculpture of an Australian soldier standing, looking pretty tough. And that's not the original one. The original one showed an Australian soldier bayoneting a German eagle at his feet. But the Germans who arrived there in 1940 were not particularly impressed with that, so they removed it and melted it down. So in the 70s, they replaced it with just a picture of an Aussie standing on the plinth. So the 2nd Division Memorial is a fantastic thing to look at. And one thing I always like to do when I'm there as well is if you go, there's a little church up on the top of the hill, and if you go behind that, there's a wooded area. It's been fenced off now to preserve it, but you can still check it out. And it's just got shell holes and trenches, and it's an unpreserved part of the battlefield. Because it's in a wood, the farmer couldn't come in and plough it, so it's just sort of been left, and it's overgrown now, and in the spring there's all flowers in there, and it's really quite beautiful. But there is quite a deep series of trenches and shell holes, and these are the German positions that were captured by the Australians during that battle. So that's a good tangible reminder as well. And I always like finding those little corners of the battlefield that feature trenches and shell holes that haven't been preserved. They're still there simply because they're there. No one's gone out of their way to preserve them. They just remain there. So that's always a nice thing to visit as well. So in my book, Walking with the Anzacs, there's a nice walking tour you can do around Mont St. Quentin and see some of those sites. But it's not going to be like some of the battlefields that you see from 1916 or 1917 that just have so many tangible reminders, simply because of the good work the Aussies did moving through there so quickly.
No, I'd agree, and like you said, Matt, I've been lucky enough to walk that ground a number of times, and I do say to the listeners, if you do get a chance, and if you when COVID and we can travel again, I would encourage everybody to go over and actually spend some time and walk these battlefields, because they're amazing. It's one thing to read these accounts and study it in textbooks. It's an absolute privilege and an honour to actually walk in the footsteps of these men who have gone before us.
Yeah, absolutely. And the town of Peronne as well, you should visit too. It's got a fantastic museum called the Historial de la Grande Guerre, so the Historial of the Great War. It's a really interesting museum. And the town of Peronne itself, there's some fantastic photos, famous photos of Australians in the streets of Peronne. And that was some pretty tough house-to-house fighting that went on in Peronne. So it's worth visiting both of those. I've got to say, they're a little bit out of the way, and they sometimes get a bit neglected. We're even guilty of that on our own tours. If we're doing a short tour that doesn't have a lot of time, we tend to focus on other areas of the Somme and the salient rather than this sort of late 1918 area, and that's a real shame, because it's the scene of Australia's greatest achievements during the First World War, was that fighting from the 8th of August until the Australians were withdrawn on the 5th of October. I think not only is our most important time of the First World War, it's probably the most important time in Australian warfare ever, that what we achieved in the second half of 1918, because it was the only time in our history where we were the main force fighting the main enemy on the main battlefield of the war. And the only time that has occurred for Australia was in that second half of 1918, from the 8th of August to the 5th of October 1918. So those battlefields are some of the most important battlefields on the planet for Australian forces, and they do get sadly neglected. So I agree, absolutely, mate. I encourage people, if you go to the Western Front, take the time, use Mont St. Quentin as a bit of a starting point, and head east from there and visit other amazing Australian battlefields, the Bushrangers Line and the the St Quentin Canal and heading all the way up to Mont, which is Australia's last battlefield of the war. Some really extraordinary places where the Australians achieved just so much.
Absolutely, and I think on that note, Matt, it's a really great way to end the show, and I thank you for coming on and giving us your precious time, and I look forward to getting you back on again and having many more great discussions on future podcasts. So, Matt, thank you very much.
It's always a pleasure, mate. Thanks for your time.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review for the podcast.